We're with former Senator and former Representative Karen Frazier, Democrat of Olympia, in the House chamber where she started. And tell us, Karen, if I recall correctly, you arrived in Olympia in 1967, was it, as a Ford Foundation intern?
That is correct.
And what was it like? I love the story that you told about how you pulled into Olympia on sort of a cold and snowy day. And tell us about you going to look for a place to stay. I think that's just wonderful.
Okay, well, I was selected to be a Ford Foundation legislative intern starting day one of the legislative session in 1967. And the Ford Foundation wanted to encourage legislatures to have staff because they basically had none, just very, very minimal compared to now. So I drove down on the Friday before the legislature was going to begin on Monday and planned to find a place to rent. Nowadays, I'd never do it at such a last minute. But I did come down the freeway in my old car without heat. There were still patches of snow in the ground, and with all my worldly possessions, found that the motels were kind of expensive here for a student budget. Okay. So I took my suitcase and went to the front porch of the local YWCA. I assumed incorrectly that they took overnight lodgers, but they didn't. But the woman who answered the door took pity on me, I think, because I looked younger than I was, and let me rent an overstuffed couch in their cavernous basement for $1.50 a night. So that's where I stayed over the weekend while I found a place to rent.
And if I recall correctly, you retired from the legislature almost exactly 50 years after you arrived here, is that right?
It was 50 years to the day of my first day as a legislative intern here in January 1967. You know, with the new electronic calendars, you can go back and look, sure. And I just did out of interest and discovered that.
Well, as coincidence would have it, my first day covering the Washington legislature as a reporter for the then Aberdeen Daily World was in January of 1967. So I wish we had bumped into one another back then. But tell us what you saw. It's a wonderful story, what we both saw. When I came in here, well, not in here, but up there in the gallery and then mingling around out there, what did the desks of these legislators look like? You didn't have any offices, for one thing.
Well, that was the first year legislators had offices, actually, January of 67. Okay. First year. Before that, they worked off their floor desk and they had secretarial support in the wings. You have to, the context is, there were no computers in those days, there were no cell phones, there were no fax machines, there were no maybe there were high-speed printers, but anyway, for some reason, they had determined that every legislator should have a set of bill books on their desk. So those were the paper copies of the bills. And of course, every day more bills are introduced, so the bill books got bigger and bigger. They had removable covers tied together with very long shoestrings. And then every night, the staff of the bill room would work late, sometimes all night, to put in untie the shoestrings, take the cover off, put the new bills in, and paste in all the amendments. And back then, the amendments were on different size papers depending on the size of the amendment. Now everything is you print it off.
It was a crazy quilt when I saw some of those. It was all different. Sometimes there were different colored pages and they were interleaved. It was amazing.
Yeah, so red were the Senate bills and blue were the House bills. Yes. And I think at that time, the numbering system was both the Senate bills and the House bills started with the same numbers, and later they changed it so the Senate bills have a different numerical sequence than the House bills, so you don't have to pay so much attention to detail.
How many female human beings were there who were interns or that you saw as representatives, Washington State representatives? Do you recall how many women served in the Washington House?
I haven't looked up the number, but there were very few. And kind of a social cultural aspect of that is when I was selected to be a Ford intern, I was the only woman among about 5 of them. And they decided they wanted to appoint me to work for a committee that had a woman chair. See, nowadays you don't even think about that. Then at the last minute, she got appointed to a different committee, and I got a male chair. Actually, a wonderful man, Jonathan Wetzel, who served with great distinction.
Who was the outgoing female chair?
Oh, I'd have to look up the name. I don't remember after all these years. She was from Queen Anne in Seattle.
Well, suffice it to say, it was a man's world. Were there still spittoons around here in those days, or had they since removed those vulgar sort of artifacts from days of yore?
Well, I don't know. I was so busy being a committee clerk and dealing with the paperwork and a whole system I'd never heard of, I didn't notice.
Tell us this wonderful story that after how you'd acquitted yourself here, the chairman of the department, who was Professor Bone, was it? Hugh D. Bone, a legendary character at the University of Washington. When he came to see you and sort of review how you'd done as a legislative intern, tell us what he said to you that sort of took you aback.
Okay, Mr. Hugh Bone, Professor Bone, at the time, he was the dean of the political science department at the University of Washington and was the university liaison and kind of overseer of the intern program. And so I was down here during the session. I worked for a standing committee. I was the committee clerk, the only staff. They didn't have attorneys and analysts assigned to committees then. Then in the interim, I worked for the largest interim committee, the Legislative Council. So in the middle of the summer, he came down to meet with all the interns, and he came into my office. I had a private office, and he closed the door, and he leaned forward, and he said, "You won them over." I thought, like, what's that about? And I really didn't know, but he explained to me that they had been very skeptical about having a woman research assistant for the Legislative Council. There'd never been one, and wondered if it would be disruptive. But apparently, I was a real nose to the grindstone type. I still kind of am.
Yeah.
And I just worked hard and did my best and enjoyed it, and apparently it all worked out.
Well, it certainly did.
I even played chess at lunch with one of the attorneys on the staff. So,
Really?
yeah,
You
so I
remember
got
who
along
that
with
was?
everybody.
Yeah, of course you did.
Yeah.
That's just you. What in this chamber here, before you moved across the Capitol, what's one of the most dramatic or fascinating moments in your years here? How many years was it in all that you were on this side of the Capitol?
I was a member of the House for 2 terms, which is 4 years. And when I first had my first day, I was seated in the very back row in the middle of the House floor, and I actually liked it because you could see everything. It was
Who was the speaker?
Speaker was Joe King.
Joe King from Vancouver. Absolutely. So is there a particularly dramatic moment in those 4 years that you spent in the House that really resonates with you in this old marble here?
Oh, there were a lot of dramatic moments. There were moments about voting on taxes. There was the moment of the famous murals on the wall.
The seven labors of Hercules, was it?
That's right. Yeah. And I concluded, since your head is so busy when you're a legislator, you're always multitasking in your head, to sit back in your chair on the floor and try to think something through, to look up and see all that busyness, I didn't think it fit very well. So I was kind of glad when they left.
Some people maintain that these abstract figures from antiquity were in sort of erotic poses or something.
There were various opinions.
Wow, that's wonderful. Can you, in those first 2 terms in the House, was there a bill that you, in your freshman and sophomore years as a legislator that you were able to get through to enact it into law?
Actually, one of the bills I'm most proud of that I was the prime sponsor of passed what I think probably, yes, it was in my 2nd term in the House. It was a bill relating to the 911 system.
Oh, of course.
And it provided funding for enhanced 911 to be funded throughout the state. At the time, most counties had 911, which meant you call for help and you have to tell them where you are and what's wrong. With enhanced 911, there's an associated computer and telephone system so that when you pick up the phone, they automatically know where you are. So if you can't speak, or if it's a kid who can't explain things, they can dispatch help. And so to fund that, the rural counties couldn't afford to do that on their own. So the bill created a small telephone tax to provide grants to go around the state. Well, it passed the House, but then the Senate Ways and Means chair didn't want to move it out of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, this life-saving bill, because it had a tax in it.
Yes.
So he gave us, our little team that was working on it, a choice. He said either we won't pass it, or if we do, we'll put a referendum on it, so it has to go on the statewide ballot. So we huddled and decided, well, the public's going to support this. So we said, okay, put a referendum on it. So then it passed the legislature with a referendum. And so then we had to organize a statewide campaign committee, et cetera, but it passed overwhelmingly, of course.
Senator Fraser, that has to be one of your most heartwarming, gratifying achievements, because I believe that I remember as a reporter at the Aberdeen newspaper, us writing editorials about how crucial that was, and the then sheriff, a fellow named Dennis Morissette, was a huge proponent of that as well. But I think you've saved thousands of lives over the year with that expedient of, suppose you're conked out on the floor, the classic I've fallen and I can't get up, or had a stroke. I mean, that's just amazing.
Or there's a burglar in the house, I don't dare talk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, yeah, well, you're from the Aberdeen area, Southwest Washington. Senator Sid Snyder was an absolute active supporter of the bill and of the campaign to get it passed.
Well, that's fabulous. Let's leave it at that. That's terrific. We got that. You're amazing. Those are highlights in probably 5 minutes flat. What you think?
Nice.
Jeremiah?
Very good.
Yeah, that is, if people ask me the bill I'm most proud of, that's the one I use.
You should be.
Yeah.
You should be. Thank
Yeah.
you, Karen.